Roots, New Art on Stage.
Welcome everybody to the 20th edition of The Art of Assembly. So it's a small anniversary. This podcast is based on an analog event on November 15th, 2022 at Brut-Theater in Vienna. Within the series, we investigate the potential of gatherings in art, activism, and politics. And over the course of the last 2 years, we have covered quite a bit of ground. So if you missed it, you might want to check out our website, art-of-assembly.net, for videos and lectures and podcasts of the full conversations and lots of other material. Today's episode has the title Nous, Accusons, People's Tribunals Between Politics, Activism and Art. And I'm very happy to welcome Lisa Ito-Tapang from the Concerned Artists of the Philippines, the human rights lawyer Wolfgang Kalek, and Madeleine Sauer, whose book about the NSU trials just has come out. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm a curator and writer and the host of this series. Assemblies within the context of art often take on established forms and play with existing procedures within society, experimenting with formats like parliaments, political parties, and last but not least, trials. So some of these court-like settings were already mentioned in past editions. For example, the Intergenerational Climate Justice Court by the lawyer Rada de Souza and the artist Jonas Stahl, or the Moscow trials initiated by theater maker Milo Rau. All of them were also guests in the series. So tonight we want to take the opportunity to look closer into the concept of tribunals, especially so-called people's tribunals that go back to the Vietnam tribunals initiated by the mathematician, philosopher and human rights activist Bertrand Russell in 1966-67. With famous participants as Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, James Baldwin, and many others. Out of this first Russell Tribunal grew the Permanent People's Tribunal in Bologna, founded in 1979, but there are also many other adaptations and continuations worldwide, some of which we will talk about tonight. Since we will hear quite a bit more about such tribunals and their history in the contributions to follow, I won't go further into it. But instead, since we are investigating assemblies in between activism and art, I don't want to forget also other influences for some of the tribunals we will be talking about tonight. For example, Brechts concept of Lehrstücke, teaching plays, that were meant to be performed by the audience, in this case the working class of course, and by making different standpoints visible within a concrete argument, Brecht's dialectical theater wanted to enable the audience to understand the system behind such debates, instead of just identifying too easily with a predetermined opinion. And then there was, of course, the popular Agitprop-Theater of the early Soviet Union, which often took the form of court hearings. They were sometimes so convincingly realistic that they actually stood in clear opposition to Brecht's dictum of distance. Walter Benjamin, who in 1926 happened to be present for such a presentation in a Presence Club in Moscow, shows in his diaries the extent to which they increasingly mingled reality and fiction. So he actually was not really able to decide, was it a real court hearing or was it a performance that he was attending. And later, of course, politics took the upper hand and Stalinist show trials turned real courtrooms into fake theater spaces. This leads directly to a very important aspect when we talk about assemblies in art and assemblies in activism or politics, and their difference. Assemblies within the realm of art, and that includes tribunals and trials, happen on a thin line. The thin line that marks the proximity as well as the distance between theater and politics. On the one hand, the inherent sociality of theatrical space makes an ideal device for political experiment. On the other hand, the simultaneous presence of the symbolic and the factual that stands in the center of all socially engaged theater becomes an essential problem when it reaches the realm of realpolitik because of its potential part or its fictitious part. So activism, of course, demands truth and authenticity, but theater has a complex relationship with both of them. So assemblies in art can transgress or blur the line dividing art and politics, undermine it or even penetrate it, but I think they never can ignore it. This demarcation, sometimes almost imperceptible, is one of the most productive challenges facing political theater, as well as one of its most powerful tools. And this has to do with the specific character of theater. Theater is a paradoxical machine in which everything is real and fictitious at once, actual and symbolic. It enables you to be part of it and at the same time observe yourself from the outside. So this is maybe important as a context in which we talk tonight about tribunals, which are sometimes a bit more on the side of art and sometimes a bit more on the side of politics, and all a little bit between both of them. And now I'm very happy to introduce our three speakers tonight. First, who will be actually the second speaker, activist and author and artist Martin Sauer, who shows how the non-governmental tribunals convened parallel to the state trials against the far-right terror group NSU in Germany use aesthetic and transformative means to practice other forms of recognition and justice. And our last speaker will be art historian and activist Lisa Ito-Tapang from Manila, who will thread through different historic people's tribunals in the Philippines, fighting against state terrorism till today. So, but our first speaker will be Wolfgang Kalek, whom I will introduce a little bit more in depth now. Wolfgang Kalek is a lawyer, author, founder, and Secretary General of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, ECCHR. He has published several books, including Die konkrete Utopie der Menschenrechte, Ein Blick zurück in die Zukunft, The Concrete Utopia of Human Rights, a book Look Back into the Future from 2021, and Law versus Power from 2018. In 2020 to 22, Kalek was a visiting lecturer at the Soren Center for International Peace and Justice at CUNY School of Law in New York. And widely known, he became with filing a criminal complaint against Donald Rumsfeld for torture and being the lawyer of Edward Snowden. And of course, for us tonight, very important is also his involvement in the Congo tribunals initiated by Milo Rau and the International Institute for Political Murder. Thank you, Wolfgang, for joining us, and the microphone is yours.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Florian, and all the organizers of this evening's event for the invitation to this interesting event. And you might not be surprised that I, as an international lawyer and a director of a legal human rights organization, won't subscribe directly to the title of today's evening, because I think you have to deal not only with people tribunals, but also with real courts, not only between politics, activism, and art, but also between politics and law and activism and art. And I think also Madeleine's speech tonight will touch upon similar topics. As a human rights lawyer, I know that justice is a very difficult topic, is difficult to achieve, and there are many roads to come, or to achieve at least to some point of justice, to some degree of justice. So justice is not exclusively realized and organized and carried out by lawyers. That's true, but there is a legal layer into it, and that's what I found interesting on the issue of tribunals. As human rights lawyers, and especially as a human rights organization which deals with human rights violations all over the world, we are very much aware of the ambivalences and the restrictions of law. Law is sometimes and oftentimes part of the problem, but it can also be part of the solution, and I will come to that. When it comes to tribunals, the most important and probably the most well-known historic tribunal is the International Military Tribunal, which the Allied victors of the Second World War held in Nuremberg against the main war criminals, the main Nazi war criminals. And here you find a very interesting, and I want to quote, a very interesting quote of Robert Jackson, this chief prosecutor, the US chief prosecutor, who said something very important which leads nearly immediately to the first opinion tribunal held by Bertrand Russell. And this quote goes as following: "And let me make clear that while this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment." So Robert Jackson, as a real important pioneer of law, wants a universal law. And while he was talking about these universal laws holding all those accountable who commit war crimes and crimes of aggression, all four nations who were sitting on trial violated exactly these laws. And I want to just mention the two colonial powers by the time, and that was the United Kingdom, which committed war crimes and crimes of aggression, amongst others in Kenya, again in the so-called Mau Mau War, but also the French in Algeria, and a little later on the war of aggression in the case of Vietnam. And here we find a very interesting coincidence of lawyers, and not only lawyers, but lawyers who were actually serving us in the prosecution's team at the Nuremberg trials. And there is especially Telford Taylor, who was one co-prosecutor, who wrote a book From Nuremberg to Vietnam. So he drew the line, and he was actually acting within the heritage of which Robert Jackson described. And this was also exactly the intention of the organizers of the first Russell Tribunal, of the first opinion tribunal. And Jean-Paul Sartre said it: we want to reanimate the spirit of Nuremberg, and we want to substitute the law of the jungle. That's what he called the American attitude, the violating the laws of the war and the leading a war of aggression in Vietnam. We want to substitute the law of the jungle by ethic and moralic rules, which were first established in Nuremberg. So, interestingly enough, they refer to an interstate tribunal, the Tribunal of Nuremberg, while organizing a people's tribunal. So this is probably the most well-known, the Vietnam Tribunal. But then later on, obviously, a whole number of tribunals took place, and I think Madeleine will also mention some of them. Why this format of tribunals? And I think we will discuss that later on. But obviously, it's the antagonistic setting, the specific essence of a courtroom drama is this antagonistic setting in the presence of different parties. The parties crash together, and that creates a very special situation, and it's a situation of confrontation, of escalation, and that is what makes tribunals so attractive. And so I cannot talk about tribunals without mentioning one of the most important tribunals, and it stands in the line of tribunals against violence committed against women. And so probably the most important was the tribunal held in 2000 by international lawyers on one of the most important cases of impunity of war crimes, and that is the war crime committed against Southeast Asian and South Asian women by the Japanese army. They were raping and forcing women into prostitution, and the pejorative expression they used was comfort woman. So it's known as the case of the comfort woman while it's a very disturbing expression. In fact, it was organized rape by the army. And the interesting thing was that they combined very different layers of a long-standing struggle, social struggle of the women which stood up in absolutely macho societies such as Japan and other countries. They organized rallies, they organized demonstration, but also they went abroad and partly very successful, for example, to the US Parliament and to other parliaments in order to seek restitution, reparation, acknowledgement for the crimes. But what I wanted to point out is the very interesting long preparation of this tribunal. It took years. It took expert opinions of some of the most outstanding law professors who worked on sexualized violence, and actually they were, and this is one of the functions. I come back to this, to the functions of tribunal. One of the functions of these tribunals is to be avant-gardistic, to be before actually to preempt developments in the law, to formulate alternatives to existing law. And so what they formulated in this tribunal was actually something which was later and is now very much acknowledged in international law, that sexualized violence is a crime, that sexualized violence is torture, that rape can be a war crime, rape can be a crime against humanity. And it stands for itself as a crime. And so that was developed during these Tokyo tribunals. So at the same time, it was a social mobilization, but it was also a very important impulse for the legal discourse. There were many other tribunals, Russell tribunals, but also then, you mentioned it, Florian, the successor, the Lelio Basso tribunals. But I want to point, I mentioned the first turning point in international law when it comes to accountability of war crimes and crimes against humanity, the Nuremberg trials. And the second turning point happened around 1998, the arrest of the former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet and the creation of the International Criminal Court. But the Pinochet case was interesting because here we see for the first time civil society's actors as the motors, as the driving forces of a tribunal against a former dictator in international criminal law. Before, we had the Nuremberg trial, we had the Eichmann trial and similar trials, and these were all events orchestrated by the states, very much also criticized, for example, by Hannah Arendt in Eichmann and Jerusalem. She criticized the state of Israel, and it was very clear civil society actors, even those affected by the crimes, even the survivors and their communities, didn't play a big role in these kind of trials. But here, from 1998 on, and similarly in the US, in cases brought against oil corporations, civil society actors were those who initiated this kind of trials. So you could ask, and it's a fair question, why do we need people's tribunals after 1998, after 2002, when civil society actors can initiate trials? The question was raised by not only Milo Rao in the Congo tribunal, but also by all of us who participated in this tribunal. But before assessing this question, I would like to describe a little bit what happened. And that was a very interesting process, and in a way, the Congo Tribunal which Milo organized is not only one tribunal, but I called it a multi-sided global event because it was a sequence of tribunals. It started sometimes in 2015 in Bukavu in eastern Congo, and then went to Berlin. Berlin because one of the most important capitalist European centers, but also Berlin because of the Congo conference back in 1881, a very symbolic place, symbolizes the exploitation of Africa. And then later on, he went also to Switzerland as the center of the bank center, one of the most important bank centers. But then he also went back to Bukavu in Congo, and he not only reenacted these tribunals in different theater places, but also filmed the events. And that was very interesting because the filming of the event led to another format, a documentary, which was then shown again in Eastern Congo. And in Eastern Congo, they had hundreds and hundreds of people who wanted to attend this because they took this format of a theater tribunal as a real tribunal. And that was a very interesting process because it shows also the potential and the dynamic eventually caused by such a theater event. You might think, how can a theater event at all has any impact in the real world? Of course, theater is part of the real world, but on the other hand, it's a bubble. So how can that happen? And that was very interesting because obviously you can always say it's a singular case, but by going to Bukavu, so the place where the crimes which were subject of the tribunal have been committed, due to the fact that there was no investigation, no official investigation of the Congolese state, due to the fact that the people were longing for justice, people took it for serious. And that made the tribunal an outstanding event because when the politicians, some of which were accused in this trial, learned about the fact that hundreds and hundreds of people wanted to attend it, they felt under pressure to attend this tribunal as well. And so it took a very interesting dynamic that out of a theater tribunal became a real tribunal where the politicians in the tribunal in Bukavu had to stand up and explain themselves and try to legitimate themselves. And some of them failed, and some of them had to quit their positions after these trials. That was a bit of the I would say success story of the Congo Tribunal. On the other hand, the Congo Tribunal, as well as many other tribunals, causes a number of questions. First of all, that's my opinion as a sometimes insider, sometimes outsider. I think you have to be very clear about what can you achieve with such a tribunal. What is your role? What are the perspectives you want to present at such a tribunal, and what can be the purposes? As I said, sometimes the tribunal can be avant-gardistic, and that was the case with the Vietnam Tribunal. That was the case with the Tokyo forced prostitution tribunal. The tribunal can scandalize facts, events, crimes that have not been discussed or taken into consideration by a broader public. Tribunals can be complementary to people's tribunals. Theater tribunals can be complementary to real trial tribunals. And I think without saying much more about the NSU tribunal and the real trial which took place at the Oberlandesgericht in Munich, I think it's a perfect example where you see that yes, there was a real trial in Munich against 5 of the perpetrators of the NSU murder series, but after a while it became very clear that the restrictions of such a criminal tribunal, especially when it comes to such a court president as we had observed in Munich. So it was very clear there were many gaps in dealing with the structure, with the system of structural racism, which was one of the most important topics of the whole. Not only of the murder series of the NSU, but also of the way how German society dealt with it. So it can be complementary, and that is something which, from my point of view, is probably a characteristic for the relation between law and art. That if it's well thought through, it can also complement each other. While lawyers and tribunals normally focus on singular events, on singular selected actors, arts and theater can develop a much more holistic view, a much more holistic perspective, can take into account historical layers of the story, because most of the crimes have a long historical record, which is normally not dealt with in a normal criminal trial. Artists can develop the complexity, can work with associations and with emotions, all the things which are very difficult to deal with in real courts. And that is also something which was outstanding in Milorau's Congo tribunal, because while in a tribunal you have to formally accuse those whom you hold as suspects. Milorau pointed out and questioned all actors involved in the Congolese scene. Not only the Congolese state, but also the Rwandan state, the Ugandan state, but also the capitals of the world like New York, London, Berlin, Zurich, the corporation, the banks, but also some of those who are normally acting as or performing or self-performing as the savers, like the United Nations of humanitarian aid people. So it was a perfect example of questioning nearly everybody's role and nearly everybody's attitude in such a crime scene as the Eastern Congo is. But I think this can only be achieved if you put a real amount of time and resources into the preparation and also into communication about this tribunal, as when you clarify the role of the different actors and also the purpose. And I think that gets sometimes, and this is I'll come to an end. This is what is sometimes getting lost, because obviously this very antagonistic setting where you have a wonderful confrontation, where you have the prosecutor versus the accused, is so attractive in a world where people feel helpless in the light of the multiple crises we're observing right now. And then people want to circumvent the sometimes long and windy road towards justice, and that is. I think that is a mistake, and especially in cases like we can observe right now, when many different actors from very different parts of our societies, like theater people, like film people, but also politicians and lawyers, want to organize a trial against Putin because of the war of aggression and the war crimes committed in the Ukraine. While we have an international criminal tribunal which is already investigating, people want to circumvene this longer and of course exhausting process of coming to justice. And also another observation, while the first tribunals, especially the Vietnam tribunal, was a case against the powerful, the most powerful nation, the leaders of the most powerful nation in the world, the United States of America, committed war crimes. There was nearly total impunity, and so intellectuals, civil society organizations in the US and outside the US organized this tribunal to encounter the law, the violence of the powerful. And here in the Ukraine tribunal, in the efforts to set up a Ukraine tribunal, you find an alliance with the powerful, especially with the Western powerful, which I think speaks for the attractive model of tribunals, but I would see it with a lot of skepticism, while I'm really convinced into the potential of people's tribunals with all the advantages and disadvantages I tried to touch upon. So that's my preliminary remark to tribunals. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. A lot to discuss in a moment. But first, I'm very happy to introduce Madeleine Sauer, who is researching the worldwide convening of non-governmental people's tribunals as an independent, diverse, and heterogeneous justice practice in her PhD at the University of Zurich. Previously, she studied stage and costume design and applied theater studies at the Academy of Fine Arts in Dresden. And in addition to her doctorate, she's a freelance writer and artist. In December 2022, her monography Wir klagen an, wir indict on the NSU tribunals will be published at Unrast Verlag. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I would also like to thank Florian for the invitation and the possibility to speak here at the Art of Assembly, but also the team from the Brut Art House for the really good organization and the support. The next 20 minutes, I would like to give you a little insight into my work and my research on the NSU tribunals, but also more generally in the whole global convening of civil society organized tribunals. And I would start straight away because we have a really strict time schedule. So in May 2017, you have the right picture to it. In May 2017, the Action Alliance Unraveling the NSU Complex convened its 5-day tribunal at Schauspiel Cologne. In its parallelism to the official NSU trial at the Higher Regional Court in Munich and to many parliamentary investigative committees, the Tribunal Alliance positioned their intervention on the one hand as a counter-trial, and on the other hand, they went beyond their counter-stance and called for radical social and systemic change with their vision of the society of the many. Over 3,000 people came together in Cologne to remember the murder victims, their families, and the many survivors of the 3 bombings committed by the Nazi terrorist network NSU, which stands for National Socialist Underground. The idea of a civil society tribunal arose 2 years earlier in the beginning of 2015, when it became foreseeable that the Federal Prosecution Office and the Court Synod will thwart the promised clarification by hiding important proofs of evidence to enforce their inadequate thesis of an alleged trio with just a few supporters. In their solidarity with the joint plaintiffs in the NSU trial, the tribunal organizers faced the great challenge of reawakening public attention, empathy, and solidarity for the victim families in the 4th year of the court trial. For this purpose, they developed a big program consisting of 38 events, like main events. You can see here one main event. It was called We Indict. It was one of the highlights on Saturday evening. Here you can also see the Depot 1, and Depot 1 was the main hall of the whole tribunal. Then we had over 19 workshops. Here you can see the workshop with Ulf Aminde and Mithat Özdemir about the memorial for the 2 bombing attacks in Cologne. There were over 6 video installations and poster exhibitions. 4 theater plays. Here you can see a picture from the theater play, Die Lücke from Nuvat David Kalis. Then we have 4 concerts and a final morning march to the Kolbstraße on Sunday. One highlight was the public assignment of the counter-indictment, in which the Alliance accused over 19 persons from the police, intelligence services, politics, media, and also the Federal Prosecution Office in the Munich court trial of their responsibility in the NSU complex. The term NSU complex understands the NSU terror as a multidimensional complex of different forms of racist violence. That means not just the physical acts of violence, but also the structural and epistemic violence, like the active silencing of the victim families for years. Another highlight was the presentation of the final report from the Institute for Forensic Architecture. And forensic architecture was commissioned by the Tribunal Alliance to investigate the still unsolved role of the intelligence service agent Andreas Temme in the murdering of Halid Yozgat. The NSU tribunals, and we have to speak here in plural because there have been already 4 NSU tribunals, and the last one was convened this June in Nuremberg, are part of the worldwide history of non-governmental processes organized by civil society groups, NGOs, and victim families, acting in the name of human rights and people's rights against crimes and injustices committed by state, institution, governments, military, international organizations, and corporations. Among them, there are the famous Russell tribunals, the Congo tribunals, the International Iran Tribunal, or the World Tribunal for Iraq. And in contrast to the NSU tribunals, they all have in common that they were first international organizations, but second, they all share a legalistic perspective in the tradition of the Vietnam War Crimes Tribunal that was convened in 1966-67 by Bertrand Russell. And it was convened, or let's say I see it like it was not just a civil disobedience, it was in fact a legal disobedience. And in fact, the convening of people's tribunals you can also describe as a very specific legal activism. And the eminent jury, you can see on the picture of the Vietnam Tribunal, gave themselves a mandate to investigate independently from any state endorsement the war crimes and the genocide committed by the United States and their allies in the Vietnam War. And the intervention had 2 goals. The first goal was to demonstrate the need for a permanent legal body that would bring all war crimes committed by all states, every time and everywhere, before court. And therein, they made a link to the Nuremberg Military Tribunal for the conviction of Nazi criminals. And second, to end the war. For this purpose, they developed a strictly legalistic procedure of investigation and presenting evidence in public hearings. Legalistic means that the organizers, often lawyers, attorneys, activists, intellectuals, artists, used the format of constitutional legal proceeding before a jury of eminent person. They formulated their indictments and conclusions in legal terms and applied valid law accordingly, like international law, national law, other body of law. In 1979, we already heard it before, the vision of a permanent legal institution was realized by the Italian lawyer and leftist politician Lillo Basso, who was also a co-organizer of the Russell tribunals, in the foundation of the Permanent People's Tribunal. And in October, here we see one of the picture, they held up their 51st session on the murder of journalists, and it was convened in a basilica in Den Haag. For the lawyer, Gabriel Sim, the difference between tribunals and a public rally speech lies exactly in the legalistic approach, in the emphasis of law. But when we try to apply this designation to the NSU tribunals, then we start to stumble. Instead of legal hearing, legal proceeding, the organizers of the NSU tribunals developed a transdisciplinary multi-format that combined different aesthetic practices of speaking, storytelling, listening, and showing, which can be understood as a very creative presentation of evidence in which poems, song lyrics, pictures, theater plays, videos, novels are given the status of evidence and testimonies. Unlike legalistic tribunals, it did not stage neutrality or objectivity. It staged empathy and community centrally. And the entire tribunal was constituted by a triad of, in German, beklagen, anklagen und einklagen, and in English, to mourn, to indict, and to demand, which are often understood as contradictory to each other. That was the whole dramaturgy and the fundament of the NSU tribunal. And I would like to illustrate this triad because you can find it in every aspect of the whole tribunal. And I would like to illustrate this on the example of the speaking group of contemporary witnesses. In contrast to the most people's tribunals, the NSU tribunal had no official prosecution team, no judges, nor a jury. Instead, we can find other speaking groups, which I call the contemporary witnesses, the moderators, the experts, and the interpreters. These four speaking positions had smooth transitions. That means sometimes the same person held multiple positions in different events. And as contemporary witnesses, I understand the victim families of the NSU complex, of course, but also survivors and victim relatives of other racist and anti-Semitic terror attacks, which witnessed on the NSU trial in Cologne and emphasized the continuity and the history of right-wing terror in Germany, contrary to the official allegation of single cases. They did not speak in the legal concept of witnesses, but of memory work. So you have this connection like in the German memory remembrance work, the term Zeitzeugen is really popular and is really strong connected. They spoke freely and self-determined about and for themselves as activists, accusers, mourners, and experts of racism. In summary, I understand the whole triad of remembrance, indictment, and social change grounded in their experiences and multi-perspectivity. And here on the right side, on this picture, you can see Mithat Özdemir. He was one of the affected persons by the nail bomb on the Kolbstraße, and he was also co-organizer of the tribunal. On top, on the left side, you can see the brothers Hasan and Özcan Yildirim, and they both owned the hair salon, and in front of the hair salon, the nail bomb exploded, and that was the reason why they were, for over 6 years, the main suspected by the police. And under them, you can see a picture in which Esther Bejarano is speaking. Esther Bejarano, she was a survivor of the concentration camp in Auschwitz, and till her death in the last year, she fought against Nazi organizations and racism. So, new speaking positions require also new places of speaking. And one of the main elements of the scenic special design at the Depot 1 at the NSU trial, NSU tribunal, were the 4 speaking islands, they are marked green, in which they broke up the theatrical separation and central perspective to the stage. You can see here also a pink bubble, and this pink bubble means that this table situation was not fixed. This area was really flexible. But it's maybe also important to know that the first spatial concept from the organizing group and especially from the working group staging was much more creative. But the problem was that the grandstand could not brought out, and of course, the argument of fire protection every time. So it was this staging was a compromise between them and the theater. Both the speaking position and the speaking islands were political responses on the ongoing marginalization of the victim families in the NSU trial. And I want to illustrate that on this graphic of the Munich courtroom. As you can see, the Joy plaintiff, they are marked yellow, sat under the gallery in the courtroom. They were effectively invisible to the public, to the press, and to everyone who wanted to show solidarity with them, because the press and the public sat directly above them in the gallery. And if the victims testified before the Senate and before the judge, they sat alone with their backs to the lawyers at a small table, it is marked red, only 2 meters away from the main defendant, Beate Zschäpe, which was at the leftist area of the pink tables. So this was the first demarcation of the whole staging concept. The second demarcation was the breakup with the conventional staging arrangement in legalistic NGO tribunals. So here you can see again a picture from the Vietnam tribunal. Here you can see a picture from the Congo tribunal in the session in Bukavu. Or here you can see one session of the Permanent People's Tribunal on Turks and courts. So if we take a closer look only at these 3 examples, there are also the same spatial arrangements of legalistic tribunals. That means we have the central perspective is on the juries of judges. The juries of judges sat mostly slightly elevated, and that creates, or let's say that emphasizes the separation between the stage where the presenting of evidence take place and a more, let's say, passive area where the audience is sitting and the press. And the NSU tribunal tried to experiment more to overcome over this separation. And also, they try to break up with the central perspective, because in the central perspective, often the victims don't have a fixed seat. And they try to give them a fixed seat on this 4-table situation on the speaking islands.
The new speaking positions and speaking islands on the NSU tribunal in Cologne did not only ask who is speaking and on whose behalf, but also how is it spoken. The question of speaking evokes the question of listening, and to listen attentive was the job of the participants, of the public, and as found in the tribunal claim, listening is a political act. And after the public reading of the indictment, the aliens handed it over to the society, to the public, because the society has to pass a judgment about the NSU complex. In the beginning of my talk, I told you that the NSU tribunals are part of the global convening of civil society tribunals. At the closer view, it is in particular part of non-legalistic or less legalistic tribunals, which practice justice and recognition, clarification and truth, not only or primarily in the idea of retributive justice, but also in the ideas of restoration, truth-telling, healing and social change, with the ideas and concepts of restorative justice and transformative justice. Some of them have a decolonial or a post-colonial or an anti-racist approach. Others uses artistic and performative practices to find new forms of community and collective exchange. Just to name 3 examples here. Here you can see the 12-day-long Hawaiian People's Tribunal, and it was convened in 1993 in the pre-colonial spirit of Aloha. And the tribunal put the United States and the Hawaiian state on trial for the genocide against the Hawaiian First Nation, the Kanaka Maoli, and against the destruction of the environment and nature. And here you can see 2 pictures of the Colombian Community Tribunal in Siloé and Cali. And here they investigate the political violence and murdering of young protesters by the police, military and paramilitary organizations during the great social protest in the last year. but also the international renowned Women's War Crimes Tribunal on Japanese military sexual slavery, convened in Tokyo in 2000, was at a closer look not so strictly legalistic as it was received. They also combined a big rally, a morning march. It opened with a Korean healing ritual and held up an international conference for gender justice. On the basis of these three big ideas of justice, retributive justice, restorative justice, and transformative justice, which we can connect perfectly with the triad of the NSU Tribunal, we can re-expose the strong political dimension without reducing its creativity and, moreover, without labeling the whole intervention as theater or performance. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to linking up in the discussion.
Thank you, Madeleine. And now I'm very happy to introduce Lisa Ito-Tapang, who is a cultural worker, writer, and independent curator based in Manila. She's the Secretary General of the Concerned Artists in the Philippines, an organization of progressive artists and cultural workers founded in 1983 as a response to censorship during the Marcos dictatorship. Since 2012, she has been teaching art history and art theory as a faculty member of the Department of Theory at the University of the Philippines College of Fine Arts, and her research, creative and curatorial interests explore intersections between art practice, socio-political engagement, and ecology. Thanks so much, Lisa, for joining us, and the microphone is yours.
Good evening, good day to everyone. I'm Lisa Ito of the Concerned Artists of the Philippines. And thank you for having us today to present and share the experience of the performance of justice in Philippine art and politics. The timing of the conversation that we have today on tribunals as spaces where politics, activism, and art intersect, it could not be more apt or urgent from where I am right now. I'm speaking to you from Manila in the Philippines. It's early morning here. But in Geneva, which is closer to you now, the Philippine government just finished its report to the United Nations Human Rights Council in its regular Universal Periodic Review. And the rights organizations who have been monitoring the process have reported that representatives from different countries, more than 30 in fact, have been calling out our own government for its failure to respect various rights and freedoms. And this brings to the table the question of how to enact justice for and by the people. Justice for the Filipino people has remained elusive.
Recording in progress.
Being very embedded deeply in the social fabric. I share here images by the late visual artist Neil Doloricon, who captures in 3 frames the degree of historical injustice that Filipinos have endured under centuries of direct colonialism and decades of neo-colonial rule under US imperialism. The people of the Philippines, the first nation of Asia to win a revolutionary war of national independence against the Western colonial power back in 1898, we continue to struggle against imperialist and feudal control over the state. And that is the reality that that many of my countrymen, fellow Filipinos, face every day. The reality of this archipelago, it remains the same across 150 years. Revolutionaries who have fought for freedom and democracy are being demonized and persecuted as bandits, subversives, or terrorists. The term red tagging has a different connotation in my country precisely because of this. Communities are transformed into a massive wave of migrant commodities for export. Our labor is priced like minerals and crops in the open market. The hands who feed the world are the first to be displaced from the biodiversity-rich lands and seas that we call home. and genuine development and progress for the people is a dream deferred and derailed under both dictatorship and liberal democracy. Yet we continue to fight. Justice by the people, therefore, is expressed in many ways. Give me a few minutes to change the slide. Oh, this one. Sorry. So justice for the people, but justice by the people, how is this enacted and how is this pursued? There are many ways of expressing justice by the people. And a few years ago, the Philippine revolutionary and exiled poet professor, Jose Maria Sison, spoke once of how the arts are essential to indicting the real criminals who roam free, enacting both symbolic and real trials across history. And the effigies that you see now here, these are simple but powerful forms of protest art here in the country. Examples of how people put presidents, put images of presidents, which are really individual heads of states symbolizing the larger system of government. Presidents are put to public trial in the parliament of the streets. All of them, all of our presidents here since Ferdinand Marcos have been regularly burned in effigy for failing to ensure access to justice. And that includes the incumbent one, who is the son of the dictator. It is not surprising to see these many forms of protest and creative forms of expression in a country that seems to put regularly on trial its former presidents, and which have ousted two from office. In the case of Ferdinand Marcos, it was the snap elections of 1986 and the civil disobedience campaign. In the case of former President Joseph Estrada, it was a failed impeachment trial ending in public outrage. Both events led to People Power 1 and People Power 2, respectively, and were acts of public judgment. And the final reckoning for these was in the streets. And finally, beyond the cities and urban centers, armed struggle remains a reality, and revolutionary justice here is not just a buzzword, but a matter of fact. So protest art, people's trials, people's tribunals, all from local to transnational levels, all are part of a wider wave of expression beyond performance platforms in the face of such persistent injustice. Professor Sison also reminds us how the form of the people's trial is an act with moral authority and political weight, precisely because it resonates with the grievances of the oppressed and traces its history to a longer genealogy of resistance against the war crimes of imperialism, fascism, and tyranny. The various expressions of the people's trial in the Philippines, for instance, Sison notes that these were inspired by historic acts of international solidarity. The Russell Tribunals against international war crimes in Vietnam of the 1960s, the Permanent People's Tribunal since the 1970s, were all events which inspired the responses here in the country. Influential Filipinos such as Amado Hernandez, who was a labor leader and national artist for literature, were also participating in such tribunals. And such people's tribunals against state terrorism and neglect continue up to today, especially today, in the decades after People Power 1 and 2. Some examples that I cite here are the Citizens Congress for Truth and Accountability, or CCTA, of 2006, the Open Source Tribunal of 2013, and the International People's Tribunal, or IPT, of 2018. And like the effigies that I showed earlier, all of these were in response to the realities and crimes of 3 presidential administrations. The CCTA, or Citizens Congress for Truth and Accountability, seen here, was organized in 2006. It took the form of public hearings to present facts around the charges of election fraud, graft and corruption, and human rights violations against the presidency of against the administration of former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Arroyo became president after the ouster of Estrada in 2001 and remained in this position until 2010. That's a long time. This court represented the height of public outrage to her attempts to remain in power, especially during the midterm, the middle of her term. And this Congress adjourned after 5 sessions, 21 witnesses and hours of testimonies and documentary evidence presented in a legalistic manner. It publicly presented its findings and recommendations, which you can revisit via the QR code seen here. The CCTA was supported by people's organizations, but it was threatened with sedition by the government during the time. The solidarity artwork that you see here is from the Concerned Artists of the Philippines, which I am with. And it reminds us why the CCTA was a vital venue for justice and public accountability, in the words that it says. When injustice is law, resistance is duty. During the term of President Benigno Aquino, Arroyo was briefly under hospital arrest, then managed to be elected for a second term in Congress back in 2013. She is back for a third time in Congress after the national elections last May. Moving on, a similar indictment of former President Rodrigo Duterte and US President Donald Trump happened with the next tribunal, which was the IPT, or International People's Tribunal, held in Belgium in 2018. This time, the tribunal convicted them and found them guilty of grave human rights violations against the Filipino people, following 31 witnesses and 14 organizational complainants. This tribunal happened in the wake of a very bloody administration, where the war against illegal drugs, counterinsurgency, leading to very grave human rights violations and militarization of the widest scale, and the committal of rights violations against women, against national minorities and indigenous peoples, against workers, against truth tellers, all happened one after the other, all the way into the pandemic. The verdict of the IPT can be read through the QR code that's in here. And looking back, we can see parallelisms between two historic citizens' trials held 12 years apart across different administrations. One was national and the other transnational in reach. Both adopted the formalities and formats of the court, the Congress, and these tribunals gathered testimonies which were vital to truth-telling across scales of political accountability. These represent initiatives by a growing movement for international justice and solidarity against national borders. And this brings us to the third example, which was the Open Source Tribunal of 2013, held against the administration of former President Benigno Aquino Jr. This forum was developed by artists, activists, and cultural workers as a creative response to another program called the New World Academy, which was held in the Netherlands as a space for creating transnational solidarity. It was the days after Super Typhoon Haiyan, or Yolanda in the Philippines. And this was one of the deadliest typhoons on record that year. It left more than 6,000 dead in our country alone. And the government's slow response was seen as a major factor behind such massive loss. This initiative gathered Dutch and Filipino migrants in a church to build solidarity and to probe into state neglect over what was called then an unnatural disaster. Many creative forms were used this time, such as poetry, song, shadow play. The shadow play was used in place of an actual effigy to be burned. To my recollection, it was also distinct from larger international relief efforts at the time. It was a humanitarian crisis, but the tribunal, this form of expression, small as it was, it specifically sought to call out for accountability of the government. Elsewhere in the Philippines, This kind of call for accountability was manifested in local and nationwide actions, which were synchronized often with the anniversaries of the disaster. Street performances such as became continuing interventions in the campaign for justice, and these stretched on for years across several cities, in fact. Performance and theater artists united with advocacy groups such as People's Surge, which was an alliance and network of Typhoon Haiyan survivors. And all of these different protests, this one was in front of another church in Manila, while others were held in different cities, in public plazas, streets, in front of schools. And these protests employed a variety of creative practices, such as mud walks, which was a reference to the stories of victims or survivors who were covered in mud during the aftermath of the storm surge. The holding of protest signs, the presence of effigies, and all of these continued as the call for justice remained elusive, even up to today. These different initiatives offer a glimpse of how both the people's movement and the art community, how both responded to tragedies, environmental destruction, and the lack of disaster preparedness. These offer a look at how our accountability, or the lack of accountability, is articulated through public and performance-based initiatives. The Open Source Tribunal and Calig-On performances, they intersected in the idea of symbolically enacting people's trials as a way of asking the question of who was responsible, who or what is responsible for the persistence of such unnatural states of calamity. Also, the principles that they sought to reinforce included many positive social values such as solidarity, creativity, equality, justice, remembering, hope, the people's empowerment. There is a slogan here, mamamayan ang mapagpasya, or the people decide, which resonates particularly even up to today. All of these point out to how the value of performative enactments of trials, it lies less in recreating an actual judicial setting, but in asserting a symbolic space for effective solidarity. I end this story with another form which was encountered in the streets some years ago. And this was an annual theatrical reenactment of a massacre in a rural town called Escalante in Negros Island. This is one of the islands where the social divide between peasants and landlords is particularly vast and striking. During the last years of the Marcos dictatorship, the rise of the resistance movement and the people's opposition there ended in a massacre in front of the town plaza. The massacre of protesting townspeople is remembered each year by the community since 1986. And in recent years, before the political situation in Negros worsened, became a space for other people in the Philippines and abroad to learn about the situation in the island and to also offer different forms of solidarity. Each presidential administration after the Marcos dictatorship has been subjected to some form of performative trial by citizens and the broad movement of the Filipino people, which was all in response to the social inequalities which are unresolved and which stem all the way back to the country's colonial past. And in connecting the Filipino people's trials across time, I believe that much can be learned from alternative tribunals or art actions as platforms for performing historical reparation, restitution, and accountability. They show us the possibilities when traditional avenues and institutions for global justice and local truth-telling remain lacking. Creative actions are interventions, not just intermissions, quote unquote. And we have much to learn from traditions of performance as protest, from street theater, effigies, trials, but also in the solidarity of the warm bodies who are in the streets. Lawyers, artists, writers, workers, everyday people, all actors in the larger project of democratization, decolonization, and the struggle against imperialism. And going back to my country, where I am, the situation here today remains quite disturbing. Civil and political rights are violated every day with impunity, even under a new administration. Human life is devalued as a commodity, or as a casualty, or as collateral damage to other things. Freedom of expression, a very basic right, remains threatened and will continue to be for as long as a few remain in power. And the larger creative project is the process and assertion of dissent, then and today. So thank you very much for listening. And people's trials may continue in the next years as the situation unfolds.
Thank you so much, Lisa. No, I find it interesting how much the examples that you brought kind of interlink and connect to each other, and then at the same time how different they are. So it already shows the variety of uses that you already spoke about for gathering material, commemorating, healing, accusing, all this range of different that you had more systematically, Madeleine, but that are part of it. I was wondering a bit, again, even though you already answered to it, but you all had a very, and you may be a little bit more doubtful, but generally a very optimistic view on the artistic role in this, like what it can bring with it, which is nice, of course. But I also was wondering isn't there a danger that you feel like, okay, we are in this artistic realm, but it means we are not really we get to perform, we get to say all these things in very different contexts, sometimes threatened with life or freedom, but in the same time we also kind of contained in a certain realm of art where we can more or less do whatever we want. I remembered, I think you in your announcement you said that in Cologne there was a confusion between is it theater, is it a real thing, and I remember this very well from some assemblies, for example, one where you also were, Lisa, the Artist Organizations International, where people, let's say, a project together with Jonas Stalt and Joanna Varsha that we did there, and where, let's say, the theater people were quite enthusiastic, also seeing this idea, is it real and not, is it symbolic, you can observe so many things. And let's say from activist sides, with generalizing came the sentence, you have to make theater out of everything. And it was not meant as a compliment, but by basically you make it fake in a way. So I would maybe ask if you three could say a little bit to also maybe the problematic side of art in this context. Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, maybe I can start answering the question. Yeah, that's a really good point. Speaking for the NSU tribunals, or especially for the first NSU tribunal in Cologne, there was a conflict even in the whole tribunal organization, a conflict between the activists and the artists, because often the artists wanted to be more experimental in the whole staging, and the activists were like, yeah, but then nobody understands that we want to be, and we are a real tribunal. And that's right, the Cologne Tribunal was reviewed and received more like a theater play, more like a performance. And it was also reviewed as like a reacted tribunal, like it wouldn't be a real one. And in the case of the NSU tribunal in Cologne, it was a political organization, it was a self-organization from over 200 persons who did it voluntarily over 2 years. And then giving this label of theater was really hard also for a lot of victims and victims related who participated into the tribunal. So that's true. On the one hand, artists and also like theater makers are a bit attracted by the idea of how we can create rooms and how we can use this artistic practices. But on the other hand, we have to
be aware that it's also necessary to push all these artistic or creative interventions into the all good political sphere, and not just in our rooms, in our theaters, in our well-known places. And I think that is one point where a lot of frustrations comes after the interventions, how we can overcome over this event and what we shall do now. And nobody has a good answering, especially from the NSU, where the whole clarification struggle is made by some lawyers, but from the artist scene and theater scene. So I don't know. I'm from the theater. Maybe that's why I'm still with hope that, but I think we have to come out of these rooms and to push it more into rooms which have not this connotation, where the politics and maybe also courts cannot say, okay, that's the arts, and they do it, that we confront them the whole time. Yeah.
Lisa, I think in the situations you described, art and activism, and for the concerned artists of the Philippines, art and activism are very much combined in one thing. But can you also relate to this struggle between art and activism as a contradiction, or are there tensions within these concepts in your situation?
Yes, certainly. It's a contradiction that artists and cultural workers I believe face every day, especially when weighing what are the possibilities of art as activism. And it's very important not to become the box that you want to escape from. That in the end, it translates into a larger movement of people who really want to change things. And that often involves actions, processes, and interventions that go beyond the making of art, towards really building solidarity amongst warm bodies. And the questions for whom and how are very important to answer at every step of the way. In many cases in the history of the concerned artists of the Philippines, it was really important to always connect with other communities and other peoples, especially those we consider the most oppressed in society. In the Philippines, that would be the peasants, the urban poor, the workers, and the national minorities, or the indigenous peoples and the fisher folk. Connecting with the life of communities, immersing with them, and creating in order to help, not uplift, but to get a better sense of what the people are going through, and to convey those realities to others. And in the process, somehow amplify their voices. This became a very important step in the kind of work that we do. And art becomes a process by which the people's stories have another platform to be articulated. So that kind of process was very important, even in the form of participating or supporting or organizing forms of tribunals such as this. In the case of the open source tribunal, for instance, it was quite clear that this was within the parameters of a cultural exchange or an artistic project. But there was the desire and the intention to really go beyond that, and to really be very straightforward about asking the question of accountability at a time when this was not being asked. So the questions for whom and how were very important as well in these steps.
Thank you. And you already mentioned one thing is, I think, maybe one could say a certain patience with procedures and the necessity to stick with something as something that you would maybe criticize with some of the artistic approaches?
No, first of all, I would not at all want to define rules for artists and for cultural institutions. They may do whatever they want to do. No, and I mean it's serious. But as soon as they claim to that their art is or the event they are organized is meant to have an impact in the real world, as soon as they try to interconnect or intervene in certain political or with these people's tribunals in legal situations, it's my personal view, I would expect a certain seriousness, which sometimes is missing for me. And so if you want to connect the topic of the trial in the theater with something outside of the theater, you must know what happens outside of the theater. And you must speak not only to the crowd in the theater, but you must learn to talk and to communicate with those outside of the tribunal. And that requires many things. That requires a very good factual knowledge, and political or even a legal analysis of the situation. And then it requires a certain language, which is sometimes not the case when people who come together in theaters like this talk to each other. But I think I'm also very optimistic, because on the other hand, I see that opening a space like a theater can open much more possibilities to reach out to many more people. And actually, the Congo Tribunal of Milorau was such an example. I mean, if we, as a human rights organization, would have organized a 3-day conference in the middle of the summer on the human rights situation in Congo, at the end of, on Sunday noon, we would be like the last remaining 30 people. And there were like 400 to 500 people seriously listening. And that's, and then, the whole event was filmed. The film was screened in screening with several hundred people. And I found that really remarkable. And then also I have to tell you about, because we were discussing it before this event, 1 week ago, my organization organized a huge event on the colonial genocide of Germany in today's Namibia and the question of reparation. 500 people came to the House of the Cultures of the World. And the former events were hosted by the Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin, again, with several hundreds people, and also all kinds of people. And I think that is due to the reputation and the outreach of cultural institutions. So I'm very hopeful that cultural institutions dare to have political ambitions. On the other hand, it comes with some obligations, I would say.
Maybe I would already also open it to you to join this conversation, and maybe starting by an artistic project. So it's a maybe good leading over. I was already mentioning Justitia identity cases, which will premiere in Brut next week. And so Jin Müller and Andreas Fleck are in the audience, and maybe you could also just bring it into the space and briefly introduce what you're doing and how it relates maybe to the conversation that we are already having, and then you all are invited also to comment and ask questions.
Yeah, thank you also very much for the very, very interesting input and talks about Tribunal. Yeah, we are actually here more or less to announce also the project of Justitia Identity Cases, which is opening next week on Thursday here at the Brut. And well, it's actually coming out of a 4 years project that is called Justitia, performative formats of justice and rights that deal specifically each year with a different legal topic, also asylum law, climate change, and also digital rights. And this year, actually, effectively, we start from the point of investigation of the relations between theater and court, and also social media, actually, or new media, or also how media is influencing verdicts or courts, and also the discussion that we are dealing with, especially, is actually bringing the discussion about identity politics to the stage, to a stage that is creating different formats of courtroom situation settings, I would say. So we didn't decide so much. We also have a tribunal situation, and but we actually start with documentary theater or restaging of the courtroom of identity betrayal, because I think it's also a lot in theater and in courtroom about the narrative, and also a little bit also about the authenticity of how you bring in your story, or it's also a lot about storytelling. And but we also try to discuss this then with this discussion about identity betrayal that is in between a queer Roma activist, Black refugee activist, and a transgender activist. So it's quite intersectional. And we try to discuss this topic about identity betrayal, or what does it also mean to be in front of court, or which identity you have in different formats, also like courtroom drama, which goes more on the emotions, or can also in a tribunal format, where the advantage, of course, is a tribunal doesn't need the court, it needs always the media. Usually in court, media is not allowed, or is more actually threatening the judge. Yeah? And yeah, courtroom, did I forget anything? Courtroom musical is also part of it, which then also deals in other formats with how you can bring in, I would say, also antagonistic discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. I think I just have a question, maybe to give it back to you. What I was thinking about in listening to the examples is that in our case, we are trying to bring different positions into the courtroom, and to create this antagonistic sphere that you were speaking about. But sometimes in a court, you also have to listen to opinions or to perspectives. Sorry, it's a bit feedbacking, right? That you don't want to listen to, or that are not in your favor. Also to position that kind of create a trauma or reenact the trauma of personal lives, or also of societies. So for me, it's the question how theater can deal with those who are re-traumatized by these actions that are staged in this sense, because in court sometimes you have these psychological support or therapeutical support for victims, but you not necessarily have them in a theater piece. Like people go out of the theater and they are kind of left alone with these traumas then. So this is the question for me, how we can bring this together.
I very much understand the question, and it's often a very serious question you have to deal with when you're representing survivors of whatever serious violence experience. But I just want to give one example where a courtroom drama which I experienced recently, and that was a trial against a Syrian colonel who was in charge in this Assad regime for a torture branch of a Syrian prison, and who was standing on trial in Koblenz the last 2 years. And it was absolutely mind-blowing when you saw how the torture survivors, the Syrian refugees who exiled in Germany, over the years converted from, let's say, objects of state violence, which they were in the dehumiliated, always on the edge of, non-existence in the Syrian prison. And by the way, one of them expressed them also later on that he felt similar as an object of state violence when he was trying to find refuge in Europe at the different European borders. And then they came to Germany and felt also very powerless, in the exiled country. But over the years, they regained their voice. And they stood up in public assemblies and in situations like this. And even in the court proceeding, what I found absolutely astonishing was when you described the situation in the court hearing where the people are heard as witnesses. So when you are a witness, you sit at a table like this in front of the court and then the prosecutor, and it's a very difficult role. And in fact, you have to prepare someone, especially a survivor of such a violence experience, to stand this situation. And so all our clients whom we represented were very much anxious of this situation. And I don't say that they were not anxious in the final pleadings, because in these trials, they also, not only the lawyers speak, but also those who are a party of the trial. And so I'm not saying that they were not anxious, but this situation, the 2-meter situation you described, was absolutely wonderful to see, because here was the Syrian colonel, and he could deal quite well with the situation of being in the court, and actually he behaved like an actor in the courtroom drama. He was writing all the time. But when these female, especially the female, that was remarkable, when the female torture survivors stood up and faced him and talked to him, but also to the German audience, you saw that they converted from a subject of state violence into an independent actor in the court. And I know that's not often the situation we had, because these were very political people, but it's a very good example how a court can actually, I again fully understood what you said, but it can also be part of the healing process to confront, the perpetrator, to confront the state, to confront those who have violence, but that must be well thought and well prepared in advance.
Lisa, you want to add something to this?
I agree that as with the setting of the court in theater or in the space of art, things can go both ways. And it's of utmost importance to be able to create a safe space. But in order to do that, anything, whether that's a proceeding or a production, must be based on serious study, planning, utmost consideration for those who are most vulnerable, who will be present. It should be because instead of creating an experience or an encounter that might be cathartic or conducive to criticality, it might end up as a traumatic experience. And this gets the possibility gets more real the more you go into public space, because there are a lot of things beyond one's control in public space. So therefore, a lot of responsibility lies with the hands of those who create such platforms and spaces. Sometimes it helps to start small with the community which you engage with closely. And there build on larger and larger efforts. I remember the efforts of different survivors and support groups of the trauma of dictatorship. Here in the Philippines, we recently marked the 50th year after the declaration of martial law back in 1972. Which was a very traumatic period for the whole country. It of course became doubly traumatic after the election results because it was the the son of the dictator who won the presidency. So the situation had a very big impact on the generation which survived and fought against the dictators to see that chapter of history be repeated again. But it also had a very big impact on the youth and the students, who many of whom who voted for the first time in their lives and who went out to really stand for their principles and their beliefs, and to see the election results negate all that. So it was a very traumatic experience for many Filipinos. And even the mention of martial law would of course bring back memories for a lot of communities and a lot of people. So it was really important to navigate different events, activities, and productions with care for the memories that would be surfaced. It helped to organize things in smaller groups where it was more possible to control and to really create a safe space. It also helped that people continued to converse, to dialogue, and to also connect with the communities. It's still an ongoing process, but what would be very important is that awareness of the kind of space one creates in the process of trying to change things.
I would come to you later and would like to talk, or would like to give you just 2 examples from the NSO organization, but maybe we can now get a bit further with the discussion and with questions. So
I think one thing that this touches upon, of course, is maybe also the difference between tribunals, which in a way, as I understand it, gather material. It's like less about an agonistic or antagonistic space, but rather like it's a pre-trial in this way. And yeah, so this is tribunals, and then there are trials, which would be more agonistic situations. And it was also a question that was on my mind in a way, because remembering another Milo Rau project, the Moscow trials, which were really a highly agonistic situation. It was a performance where, protagonists of 3 different trials against artists in Russia, in Moscow, were taking part. And it was on one hand artists, art critics, etc. On the other hand, also Orthodox activists, right-wing politicians, and so on. So it was actually a very charged and quite intense situation for all participants in there. And in this regard, it was not a tribunal. It was a trial in terms of that, even the idea that there would be a judgment where an independent jury would give a judgment, and it was very narrow in the end, was taking part of it. So the question of like, where's the agonism or where's the antagonism in this, I guess is very much that the tribunals already see themselves in an antagonistic situation in which they act. So the bigger picture would be the antagonistic situation.
But they pretend to reenact an antagonism, which they don't do in most of the cases. So I think that's a shortcoming. It would be much stronger to have, strong defenders of the status quo, or strong defenders of whatever we accuse of. I think that would make the whole thing much stronger. Also because referring to your first question about the impact of tribunals when they are, or of artistical events, the more serious the arguments are elaborated, and the more you differentiate between the more you stick to a strong established factual basis, the more you differentiate between this is the legal status quo and this is another interpretation of the law, which I would propose because it's more in accordance with human rights, and of course with political claims which go beyond the clearer it would be. And in this sense, I would like to contradict you, because you said about the Tokyo trial, the opinion tribunal and the Vietnam tribunal. This is an example of legal activism. No, I think we don't consider ourselves as legal activists. The legal activist, this is diminutive. You know, this is what the other side tells us. If we appear in court, or if we appear in, let's say, parliamentary hearings, these are the experts, the professors from the universities, and we are the legal activists. And you know, while they are representing particular opinions or party opinions, defending, for example, the nuclear industry or whatever, the pesticide industry, we are accused of being activists because we take the position of the peasants and try to argue legally and try to enforce another interpretation of law. So I would also I would opt for a little more clarification in this sense.
I would be more open for maybe questions, because we did not open it yet.
Yes, are there comments, questions, arguments? Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe considering your first question on like the interrelation of activism and art and politics and law, like if there's really something that can happen, and maybe connecting to the third circle of your triad, the transformative justice. I was wondering if, and I'm asking all of you, if there is a notion of transformative or transforming justice, how all of these tribunals, for example, that we saw today, can transform law and legal policies and also legal practices. And because I found, Madeleine, your analysis of the spatial analysis of the staging of the areas of the topography of the positions of speaking and everything so convincing, I was wondering if all of you think that in the end, maybe all these tribunals can and will influence design of a courtroom to start, you know, somewhere like, where speakers sit, where witnesses sit, and how close in relation to whom they sit and can be seen, and who sees whom, and so on.
Thank you for your question. Okay, first, transformative justice is it's a political movement, and they arose in they claim that they found themselves in the 1990s, but they, of course, they have their roots in the Black liberation movement, and especially, or in particular, of the feminist and queer Black liberation movement. So transformative justice it's more often it's connected to abolition, as to abolish the police, to abolish the whole police system, the penal system. So it's a special perspective, and I would say that that maybe we could more talk about in general about social justice, because transformative justice, they like to provide gender justice, social justice, climate justice. But one thing that I find really interesting in this justice idea is the perspective of community building, and to really go into a transformation of the society. And that means that they claim that when you struggle, or when you make a struggle, that in your center, in the very heart, in your center, they have to be the victims of these crimes you fight against, or like marginalized peoples, marginalized groups. And so they have a other connection of community building, and how we can build this with love, friendship, a lot of empathy. So I would say, I don't know if we can if we can use like in big international people's tribunals, where it is really about to make the presentation of evidence. In the NSU tribunal, they also, of course, they could also be very creative because there was the criminal court trial and they used every material around. They used the whole presenting of evidence of the parliamentary investigation committees. So they had a lot of material, but the most of the international people's tribunals do this evidence at first, when often no evidence is taken by any state initiative. But the whole aspect of spatial arrangements, I think, of course, when you like, it's always a question of strategy. The legal perspective is really needed and necessary. We needed to fight with law in the name of law and to extend the law, to make it more feminist, to decolonize the law and to democratize it. And in this perspective, because you have this legalistic approach, right? You need this terms of who is sitting there, who is speaking there, who have the mandate to speak for someone. And I don't know if we, I don't know how useful it would be to take this very transformative spatial arrangement and to put it onto other legal or to other courts or legal proceedings. But I would wish that in the organization there would be maybe a more aware question of it. And then you can decide, no, I will use this tragedy because of this, because we pursue this goal, and then it's a decision. But I have the feeling that often this spatial arrangement is not a part of the reflection process. Sometimes it's just adapted. So it's just my feeling. Yeah.
I would say there is much more potential in the let's say legal strategy, in legal settings, and especially, for example, the spatial setting you describe. I would say this could be a topic of a struggle within the courtroom, to say, look, this is a public trial and we are hidden for the public, and so why don't you rearrange it? So at least it would have questioned the setting, so that would be possible. And also there are a lot of historical examples where lawyers, for example, one of the most famous example, Jacques Vergès, who was defending the Algerian anti-colonial fighters, turned the trial against the Algerian colonial fighters into an accusation of the colonial power of France, and that's a question of the legal strategy, which is, of course, he has discussed with his clients, and so obviously that has not particularly improved their chances to get acquitted. But they chose to make it to turn it into a political tribunal against the trial and against the colonial power. And so in this sense, I'm talking about Germany. I'm not talking about Austria, because Austria in this sense is different. In Germany, the student movement and the trials against the student movements, the lawyer who came there, activists like Fritz Teufel or Dieter Kunzelmann, used the courtroom as a theater space. Again, it was not nearly in favor for a low sentence, but that was not their choice. So I would say, it's important to know the legal setting, but you can also overcome it, and you can use the courtroom in whatever way. You should know about the consequences, but there is much more possible than we observe in everyday court hearings.
Lisa, you want to add something?
As for me, I continue to have hope that forms such as tribunals, trials, especially those which are initiated by people's movements and communities, that they have some transformative potential. Whether that will change the policy and the laws and the and structures which are deeply embedded in society, if that's possible, I'm not sure. But for certain, these kinds of actions have the possibility of transforming things which are related to culture and consciousness. For instance, transforming the archive. You have a body of documents which says that this is not what happened. There were crimes committed against humanity, which might not have been recognized or validated in the traditional structures that there are, but there was an effort to assert that point. And that transforms the kind of knowledge that is passed on from generation to generation, that there will always be a document which will contradict what the prevailing status quo says. When I was preparing for this presentation, just going back to the documents of the previous tribunals it was not just an exercise in remembering, because these were things which at that time, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, were very huge, grave transgressions of human rights, which should never be forgotten. And having that kind of archive in the form of what remains after the trial is very important. These have the capacity to influence the institutional contexts and dynamics, and perhaps even individual memories of the people who participated in that. And if it's possible for these actions to create that kind of space where people can say that their voices, that their stories were heard and affirmed, and for a temporary moment, given the space to air out not just grievances but the aspirations for justice, that's a very important undertaking. So all of these stories, facts, the testimonies that are gathered in the course of hard work for tribunals and archives are very crucial. I think not just from the legal aspect, but also from the cultural aspect as well. And if in the process it makes the limits, it makes one more aware of what the limits of the current system are, it's a very important exercise in knowing what should be done next. That's it.
Thank you. If there's a very urgent comment or questions, we would take it. Otherwise, I would suggest we move the conversation into a more informal one, since it has become late for you, especially very late or early, Elisa. So thank you very much for joining this conversation. Thank you as well very much for coming, and hope to see you again.